Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this webinar on Writing Effective Research Funding Applications. I'm Helen, the facilitator for this webinar, and currently serving as part of the ASCILITE executive and organizing the series of ASCILITE webinars this year. First, I would like to introduce you to the facilitator for this afternoon's webinar, Associate Professor Helen Farley. Helen is an Associate Professor of Digital Futures at the Australian Digital Futures Institute at the University of Southern Queensland, USQ. She is currently leading the USQ-led Collaborative Research Network CRN project with ANU and UniSA to develop a mobile learning evaluation framework. She was also the project lead of the alt-funded From Access to Success project, which developed an internet-independent version of Moodle that will enable electronic access to course materials and activities for those students without internet access. This project has been so successful that Helen and ADFI were awarded $4.4 million through the Australian Government's Higher Education Participation and Pathways program to take the Moodle and notebook computers to Indigenous and non-Indigenous incarcerated students across Australia. Helen has many years' experience as an educator in higher education and as a researcher in educational technology. Now, for this afternoon's 1-hour webinar, Helen will share for about maybe 30 minutes, and the remaining time will be open for a question and answer session. Now, during the question and answer session, you could either post your questions in the chat box or click onto the right hand raising button located on the left right below the image box, and we'll give you the right to speak. And when speaking, you can click onto the talk button. And after speaking, you can release the talk button. So without further ado, could you please help me to welcome Helen Farley.
Thanks very much, Helen. That was quite the introduction. So I'm just going to talk to you a little bit today about the things I've learned, the hard-won things I've learned about writing funding applications. And it seems to me that there are just, a handful of really fundamental things that people do wrong when they're thinking about their research applications and writing their proposals. So I'm just going to go through some of those things, and I'm going to use some of my own funding applications as examples, but I'd also be very interested in hearing about your experiences with funding applications as well. The one thing I can say about writing an application is you've got to be completely pragmatic about it. You've got to put your ego aside, and you've just got to do whatever is necessary to get that funding. And that's something that a lot of people really struggle with doing. So I'm going to go over a series of things. There's something new on each slide, and probably the easiest thing to do, if you have a question about a particular slide or anything that I'm saying, please just pop it into the chat box as we go along. There's not too many of us here, so I think we can have a pretty good conversation. So if you're happy with that and everyone can hear me, let's get going. So as I said, you've got to be completely pragmatic about this. You've got to put your ego aside when you're writing a funding application. And I see this time and time again. I help lots of people to write their own funding applications, and I see lots of people argue with the funding body as to what should be funded, how they should be doing things, how they should the sorts of things they're asking for. Now, when the funding body puts out the call for applications, they have some very particular things in mind. And no matter how much you make a case for them funding something else, if that's not what they have in mind, they are not going to be funding it. Now, I can give you an example from my previous life. For those who know me, before I came into educational technology, I used to actually be a lecturer in studies in religion. And my particular research interest was the history of esotericism and occultism, which is a long way from where I am today. And I once applied for some funding from the Yale Institute of Divinity, and they wanted someone to do some research about sacred music. Now, in my world, I thought heavy metal music was sacred music, so I made the case that heavy metal music was a form of sacred music and therefore I should get that funding. But you know what? It wasn't what they had in mind. They weren't looking to fund something in heavy metal music. They were looking to fund something in Christian music. So, you know, I was totally barking up the wrong tree. But by the time I found that out, I'd put days and weeks into a big application that was never ever going to be successful. So you have to really know what the funding body wants, understand what it is that they need, and then, you know, pitch a proposal in that space. You cannot argue with them and you will not win. So do not argue with the funding body, number one. So does anyone else have some similar experiences of that they can relate? Now, Jessica, do you have something there? Hi, Jessica. No? Okay, we'll continue. So read the funding rules closely and quote them back. No, that's fine, Jessica. So read the funding rules. So when you're applying for some funding, make sure that you print those rules out. Read them very, very carefully. You know what? That sounds really, really obvious, but I've seen so many people not do that. When I print those funding rules out, I get a highlighter out. So those things which are particularly significant, highlight them so you know what's important and what you have to respond to. So for example, I watched a young man put a lot of effort into writing a funding application, and yet he was from the wrong geographical area to actually apply for that. So the funding body was actually looking for some research to be done somewhere in northern New South Wales. He had completely somehow missed that, written this application, and upon closer scrutiny it was just not eligible. So you must read those rules very closely. You also have to quote those rules back to them to show that you're addressing them. There's no better way to show that you're addressing those funding rules or addressing those funding criteria than just to quote those things back to them. So, for example, if you're talking about innovation, if you're applying for funding for a particular innovation, show how something is going to be innovative. You know, quote it back to them. It's very, very important. And again, lots and lots of people just do not do that. At the moment, I'm writing an application for an OLT program award. Again, I've gone through it all. I've highlighted those things that are very important. I've addressed the criteria, and you know what? They'll find a lot of those words back in their own terms. So it's a really important thing to do. So is everyone with me so far? I'm gathering. Yeah, cool bananas. Now, the one thing that funding bodies really like to see is that you're not just doing a small project. They like to see that you're doing something that can be applied elsewhere. So, for example, I'm doing a large project on bringing digital technologies into prisons to provide access to higher education. But that's not the way I pitched it. The way I pitched it was that there are lots of people in Australia without access to the internet. There are all these groups of people. There are fly-in, fly-out workers. There are Antarctic workers working on the Antarctic bases. There are Defence Force personnel on deployment overseas. There are people in regional and remote Australia where they do not have good, reliable internet, and makes it really hard for them to access higher education. So when I wrote the application, I wrote it about people without internet access. Now, it was always my desire to actually provide higher education to prisoners, but that's not how I pitched it. I pitched it as being applicable to a broader group, and I pitched it so that I was testing it with a subset. So on paper, my project is really about people in Australia without internet access and how we can make higher education, digital higher education, available to them. But the subset I'm testing it with are actually prisoners who don't have access to the internet. So that's a really important thing to do, because it's not hard to see. If I can make something work with prisoners, then I can make it work with those people in regional and remote communities. I can make it work with those fly-in, fly-out, drive-in, drive-out workers. So make it broadly applicable and test it with a subset. Does anyone have any questions at this stage? Cool. All right. Now, I know it's really tempting to squish stuff up, right? You know, so an OLT, you're writing an OLT, well, not that you're likely to be anymore, but, you know, you're normally limited to, say, 10 A4 pages. You make the borders as small as possible, you make the font as small as possible, you test out about 4 fonts to see which one allows you to get the biggest number of words in. And you know what? That looks like crap. So you make tiny margins, you don't have paragraph breaks, you've got all the text squished up, and it makes it very difficult to read. And yeah, right, Alan, you're right. Sometimes there are fixed formats, but you still have some influence over how that looks by allowing spacing. So big paragraphs are really difficult to read. Big long paragraphs are difficult to read. Big long sentences are difficult to read. So it's no good having a 5-line sentence. I mean, that sentence might say everything you want it to say, but really, to make it more readable, split that into 2, and probably don't have any more than 10 or 12 lines in a paragraph, and then separate those paragraphs up. So anything you can do to increase readability increases your chances of getting funded. Just think of the poor people who are assessing these funding applications. They've probably got 30 or 40 of these to look through, and they're probably doing it on a plane between Brisbane and Melbourne or something like that. So make it as easy as you can for them, and that's likely to step out. And it's also a visual cue as well, because then your application visually stands out and makes it easier to remember. So avoid cramped text without space. There is a sacrifice in the amount of stuff that you can actually fit in that, but it's just so totally worth doing. Okay, is everyone with me so far? Annexes, appendices, it depends. Sometimes you're not allowed to use appendices. If you can use appendices, do so. Even if, what I always try and do is use an appendix if I have that opportunity. So for example, for an OLT application there was also space to put in a 1-page summary of the technology. Now, I didn't really need to put that in to explain the technology. The technology was pretty self-evident. But I did make sure that I used that page and used it as an opportunity to talk more about the technology and its advantages. So if you can use an appendix, and if you are allowed to do so, I would do so, and use that as an opportunity to say a little bit more about what you're doing. But again, the same rules apply, make it look pretty. Yeah, most applications are pretty strict about word limits. I'm just thinking about this LLT award application that I'm putting in at the moment. I have the opportunity to put in an extra page about the contribution of individual project members, but not all applications require. But because I have the option of using that extra page, I have jumped at it and used that extra page to talk about my team and their expertise. So most are pretty strict, but sometimes there is some leeway with appendices. Okay, we're good? Now I've just lost my cursor. Probably having too many screens. Okay. Now this one is really important. This is a great way to save space. A picture speaks 1,000 words. So if you're doing something a bit complicated, draw it. Don't try and describe it. Now I use this particularly when I'm talking about how my project will run. You know, the different stages of a project, or I might do this to explain evaluation and the different layers of evaluation, something like that. And also, again, it breaks it up visually and makes it look a bit interesting. So make sure there's a good reason for using it, but if you can use a picture, do so, because it makes it look, it can explain things really well that are difficult to describe. If you are going to use a diagram, make sure that you make it a really good one. I've seen all sorts of squashed shapes squeezed into odd spots and bad labelling and all that sort of stuff. If it's going to be like that, just leave it out. But you know, make sure that your circles are circular, that they're overlapping by the right degree. Avoid shading, because often these applications are photocopied, and if they're shaded, that often, you know, quite often doesn't work well. Keep it simple and easy to read, but if you can do that, you can really save a lot of space. So how's everyone going? Any comments at this stage? No. Cool. All right. Now get your budget right, and this is really important. So what happens is that the funding body is looking at all the projects and they're seeing what project represents value for money. So I just not addressed before to address Jessica's question. Yeah, I use images unless they specifically say not to use images. Now some applications will specifically say do not use images, or if it's an online form you may not be allowed to use an image. Otherwise you can. And again, it's a balancing act between not making the image too big and all that kind of things, but definitely some use images. So for my OLT award, I put an image in that explaining how I was going to conduct the evaluation, and that was way easier than me describing it. And I also did that too for demonstrating how I was going to do data collection and the aspect of it. So makes it much easier. So funding bodies are looking for value for money, but they're not stupid either. So if you say, okay, I'm going to do this and this and this and this and this, I'm going to do whole heaps of stuff, I'm going to do it in not much time, and I'm going to do it for not much money, that's too good to be true. So no one will believe that you're able to do that. Likewise, if you've got a lot of senior people in there, it's costing a lot of money, you're not really producing much at the end of it, you know, that doesn't represent value for money either. Also in this, you've got to make sure that every member of the team has a discernible role, that you're not just pulling someone onto the project for their track record, because that's a really obvious thing to do, and I've seen that done lots, and then that person not have a very well-defined role within the project. Make sure that every person on that project is doing something, they're at the right level of seniority, and that the project represents value for money while not representing too much value for money. So get your budget right, and to suit the project and the team. Also in this, most funding agencies are looking for some in-kind contribution from the institution as well. So a funding body will be reluctant to plough a whole heap of money into the project if the institution that you're working at won't put in some in-kind contribution or even a cash contribution in some cases. So make sure that you do that and get that squared away as well. And make sure that if you are going to use an in-kind contribution, that you've got a genuine use for that time, because funding bodies also see through that as well. When you're just pulling people onto the project, saying they're delivering time in kind to the project, and yet, you know, you can't see any value in doing that. So it's got to be, again, those people making a genuine contribution to the project. I tend not to have alternatives in a range. So Colin, here, do you mean that for yourself you have a range of alternatives? Or do you mean that you present a range of alternatives to the funding body? For myself, I always have a range of alternatives. So I think, okay, if I have this much money, I can do this. If I have a bit more, I can do a bit more, and so on and so forth. But I will never, ever present those alternatives to the funding body because they will go for the smaller one every time, just about. If you put the alternative of a smaller budget to a funding body, they won't see the value in a large project. They're interested in funding the most number of projects they can for the least amount of money. A big project and an alternative small project. So like I said, I keep that for myself. At any one time, I probably have 7 or 8 project ideas on the go with a different range of budgets, so that I can be reactive. So if I see a funding call come through, you know, it's for $200,000, say, then I can say, okay, well, I've got the project for that. And you've worked through it enough to know what's going to be doable, and already have pulled project partners on board and those sorts of things. But maybe I can talk a bit more about that at the end. Again, this is a really important thing. Align your project with government, institutional and funding body priorities and demonstrate that alignment. And again, what I do is I quote the words in that documentation back to the funding body. So I have a folder on my computer called Grant Resources, and in that I have the Australian government priorities, funding priorities. I have, you know, information about the National Innovation Strategy. I have the same for Queensland government and Queensland strategies and funding priorities, funding body priorities, and also I make sure that I have all that documentation from my institution. So I have the USQ strategic plan on hand. I have the Run University's strategic plan on hand. And so I can demonstrate that not only is my project aligning with government priorities, whether that be state or federal, but also the best place to do that project is actually at my institution because it aligns with institutional priorities. So for example, again, going back to my my prison project. USQ has a really strong social justice agenda, and our mission is to partner with students in the delivery of higher education, no matter what their position in life or socio-economic status or something. I don't know, something like that. So I can say, okay, we're going to do this project here because here is the best place to do it, because it's, you know, social justice is what we live and breathe. And so in one fell swoop, I'm demonstrating that I'm aligning with government priorities, but I'm also that it's best to do it at this institution because it aligns with my institutional priorities. And so save yourself some time and download those documents and have them already. So all the federal government documentation, all the funding body documentation, your institutional documentation, so you're not going to search for it, you know, when you are actually writing out these applications. How are we going? Am I doing all right? And like I said, quote all that stuff back to them. Yes, you know, so all right, I'm doing this project, it aligns with the priorities, and then, you know, quote, you know, name the document, name the priority, and show how you're aligning with that. A really important thing to do. Now look, this is a really tricky one if you don't have track record. So you've got a couple of options here. You can pull on people who do have track record, but you know what? Those people are really, really busy, and those people are often really, really expensive. So by the time you're pulling someone with track record onto a project, you're talking about a professor or an associate professor, and you know, those people are expensive in your project. Those people are also hellishly busy, so they're not going to have that much time. Should you get the funding, you're going to have a really hard time getting anything out of them just because they are busy. So you've got to be really sure, if you're pulling someone onto a project for track record, that you're equipped to deal with what that entails. For the rest of us, if you don't have track records, there are ways of generating track records in small amounts of time. So the biggest indication of citation rates, or the biggest indication of how well an article is going to be cited, is time. We say it's about being in high impact journals, we say about all those sorts of things, but even in a high impact journal, the citation rate is not going to be high in a short period of time. It's going to take 5, 10, 15 years for an article to become really highly, highly cited, unless it's something very topical like Brexit. You know, I'm sure any articles about Brexit will be cited a lot right now. So if you don't have a track record, generate one. And the way I do this is by using social media. So what you can do is make sure you get your paper, make sure you put it in your institutional repository. That's the first thing you've got to do. Maybe a pre-publication copy that you can give out without you know, defouling the copyright of the journal that you've published in. But start publicising it on Twitter and stuff like that. A really great place where I find I get a heap of hits from, and the numbers look good in a very short amount of time, is SlideShare. So what I do, I used to put all my presentations up there, and you'll find this presentation up there. And that's fine, but you can also put papers up there as well. And I find those papers get downloaded an awful lot. So, okay, so I want to put down on my CV that I did this presentation. If I've got it in SlideShare, I can say, okay, this is as of the 1st of July, this presentation has been downloaded 400 times from SlideShare. Something like that. For those of you whose institutions subscribe, Altmetrics is also really good. We don't subscribe to that here at USQ, but I know at UQ they do, and other institutions. That's a similar kind of thing. What sort of impact your articles are making in the wider world beyond just citation rates. So I must admit I'm a social media junkie. I publicise myself through Facebook. Facebook groups are really good and a good way to get your stuff out there. I disseminate them through Twitter as well. I put them on LinkedIn, I put them on SlideShare, I put them on ResearchGate, I put them on Academia EDU. All these things generate statistics. Another good thing that I use is an application called Scoopit, and I don't know, I'll write that in chat here. Scoopit is actually a digital curation tool. You put in some keywords, it will grab stuff from all over the web for you to have a look at, and you curate the things you like into a paper. So I've got 4 or 5 of them. I've got one on digital literacies for prisoners, I've got one on mobile learning in higher education, I've got one in ebooks in higher education, and a couple of others. And what I do is I put my publications in those as well. There are ways to make it for you to be able to do that. And then that also helps you just to automatically disseminate it to all those other things. So through that I can automatically disseminate it to Facebook, to LinkedIn, and so on and so forth. And so that puts a bit of automation into it, so you're not spending your whole time doing social media. And before you know it, those numbers, those download numbers grow very quickly. And you can say, okay, it's been viewed 200 times on LinkedIn, it's been downloaded 400 times from SlideShare, and so on and so forth. And you can generate those kinds of numbers within a few months rather than, you know, within years for citation rates. If you have citation rates, that's awesome. Or if you don't, using social media is a good shortcut to doing it. It also is a good way of demonstrating an interest in an area as well. And so the reason I have an ebooks in higher education Scoopit account is because I was putting in some applications around ebooks, and I could demonstrate that I had an interest and track record in this area by quoting my Scoopit statistics, for example. So it's good from there as well. Do you list these in the CV or as part of the application? Depends where you can put them. You can put them in your CV, and I think that's a good thing to do, but also be aware that those numbers change very quickly, so you've got to update them all the time. And sometimes I will put them in the application. You know, if I want to demonstrate interest in an area or something like that. So either or there. Social media is really powerful. If you can harness that, you're doing really well. Okay, look at previously funded projects. So that's what I always go to. For example, I might apply for funding from the Australian Criminology Institute. Among their guidelines, there is nothing saying how much money I can actually apply for. You know, I think, okay, well, the sky's the limit. I'm going to put in a $2 million project. But instead, what I will do is go back and look at previously funded projects. Do they, you know, what sort of funding are we looking at? So, okay, most of those projects are looking at sort of like they're around $80,000 or $90,000 or something like that. So it seems unlikely I'm going to be successful if I put in a $2 million project. You also get some indication too as to what people are funding if you have a look at those previously funded projects. The kinds of things that they're favouring, the kinds of things that they're not. Unfortunately, what you don't see is what they're not funding. And I think the exception to this might be the ARC, where you can see the number of applications and you can see how many of the applications in a certain area were funded. Just one more way of being able to target your application. Because putting in a funding application is an enormously time-consuming thing to do. So you don't want to do it unless you've got a reasonable chance of being successful. The other thing you can do is look at what's being funded and look for the gaps. Where are the gaps existing here? And maybe you can fill one of those gaps. And again, I would be citing it back to them. Okay, well, we can see you funded lots of stuff in here. You know, what's really crucial and what will make all those projects work better is if you fund my project to do something that's quite different. So that conflicting advice, make yours look like that or not, really depends on the circumstances. Okay, we all going okay? Cool. Okay, I can't tell you how powerful this is to demonstrate a pilot project with proposed project partners, even if it's only little. What funding bodies want to know is that if you've got a team of people and if you've got someone working with project partners, that they're actually going to make it to the end of that project still speaking to each other. So what I did was, just to give you a bit of my big project. So my first project was in about 2011, 2012, my first prison project. It was called Portable Learning Environments for Incarcerated Distance Education Students, a long mouthful. And it was unfunded. So where I work, the Australian Digital Futures Institute, kicked in a bit of money, kicked in a bit of my in-kind time, and I worked with Serco, who operate the Southern Queensland Correctional Centre, to run a little pilot project. We also worked with Queensland Corrective Services, only a little pilot, unfunded, a few $1,000s to run, but the USQ, or the Australian Digital Futures Institute, kicked in. And we all got on well, and we wrote some papers, and it was all fine. By the time I came to apply for my next round of funding, I applied for the OLT award, OLT application. So it was a $217,000 project. And I could say, you know what, we tested these technologies in a small-scale pilot. That worked really well. We found that we worked with Serco really well, and we found out we worked with Queensland Corrective Services really well, and in fact we worked with them so well they want to be our project partners again. So we were successful in securing that funding. And so we did that again. So okay, it worked in Pleiades, it worked in From Access to Success. Then we applied for $4.4 million funding. And again, you know, I was able to say, well, the Pleiades project worked okay, and we demonstrated the technologies. We moved it forward in the From Access to Success project, and now these project partners want to come together once more in this much bigger and much more ambitious project. So we still have the same project partners as when we started this 5 years ago, except now we've gone from no money to $4.4 million. And it was all based on demonstrating that continuity through pilot projects and demonstrating the strength of those relationships with those project partners as well. So it's a really important thing to do. So if you are thinking about a project, demonstrate a pre-existing relationship, because nothing looks as dodgy as just suddenly pulling a whole group of disparate people together on a project and you have no track record of working together. How do you know that you are going to be able to work together? And how will the funding body know that you are able to work together? So even if it's only little, do a little bit of something. Okay. And this is just the same, really. This builds on the previous ones. You know, don't start your whole research grant career looking for an ARC linkage, you know, a $600,000 ARC linkage or something bigger. Start with little things, you know, so it might be an unfunded pilot project. It might be some, you know, a few $1,000s of an ECR grant that your institution provides. Don't turn your nose up at those. They're really important because it shows that you can plan, you can budget, you can do all those sorts of things, and your grants will get incrementally bigger. So that before too much longer, you know, within probably 18 months or 2 years, you can go for those ARC grants and with a reasonable expectation that you will be competitive. So don't turn your nose up at small amounts of money. You know, use them to build to bigger bits. By the same token, don't just keep going for small amounts of money. So if you have 37 $3,000 grants, you're really better off having three $3,000 grants and then, you know, a couple of $100,000 ones and going up like that. The one thing with small grants is that you work really, really hard for the money usually, because you're not able to buy out people's time and you're not able to buy in expertise. So you are doing a lot of work yourself, and it is, you know, very time intensive and resource intensive, which is another really great reason not to get 37 of them. Okay. Now this one sounds really obvious. Somewhere say what you do. I don't know how many grant applications I've read. I've started at the beginning, gone right through to the end, and still not have a really good idea of what the person is doing. So somewhere you must say exactly what you're going to do in one paragraph. So, okay, what we're doing is, you know, prisoners don't have access to the internet. We want to provide them with digital higher education. We are creating technologies that don't use internet access. We will put them in 3 correctional centres to start with, and then incrementally out to more. We're using 2 types of technology. We're using a notebook computer and we're using a server solution. In the first year we will go to Queensland, in the second year we will go to Western Australia and to Victoria, in the third year we will go to the Northern Territory and somewhere else. You know, so just very simply say what it is, what you're going to do, so that when someone's talking about your grants idea, they can say it. They have a really clear idea of what it is and can say that to someone else. I put this presentation up on LinkedIn when I delivered it previously, and I had quite a few people actually comment that this is very often what people don't do. They don't say what they're going to do. The other thing you've got to do, and this could be the next slide, so maybe I should go on to that, is say it right up front. Now we're academics and we're researchers, and quite often what we want to do is build the case for what we're going to do. Okay, you know, prisoners have it really tough in Australia. They don't have any access to the internet, and that's a real bummer because, you know, most universities are online. You know, and if only we could educate prisoners, we reduce them from reoffending by some 40%. That's a really big cost saving to the government. And, you know, we need to imbue them with digital literacy skills, because one day they're going to get out and they're going to have to do internet banking and stuff. And then, so we've decided that the best thing we can do is introduce computers into correctional centres to teach these people digital literacy skills. You know what? By the time I get to that, the person who's looking at that has given up. So say what you'll do right up front. Say it in the first paragraph. This project, and usually give your project a name. So the Making the Connection project will introduce internet-independent technologies into correctional centres to provide access to digital higher education for prisoners. You know, well, they know exactly what I'm going to do. Then, underneath that, say why that's a really great thing to do. Then you say, well, you know, they don't get access to the internet and blah, 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 blah. But right up in that first paragraph, say it. And that's not what we do as academics. We like to build the case, but that is disastrous. So say it right up front. How are we going? All right? I feel like I'm talking a lot. And I can keep talking. Okay. Now, I seeing this lots, and you see it often with very young researchers, is that people hold on to their ideas. They have one good idea and they will not give it up. At least they think it's a good idea. If you put in a similar application or an application for a similar project 3 or 4 times and you've had not a bite on it, time to put it away, or time to look at it very closely and figure out what is not appealing about that project. So I talked about I've completely forgotten. I was looking at Helen's question and now I've forgotten what I was saying. Yeah, can't remember. Let me look at Alan's question. How about the importance of aligning methodologies with the research questions with clear frameworks? As long as it's all really clear, I think that's really important, is to make it really clear, and that's where diagrams really help. I wouldn't get too hung up on methodologies, because unless you're applying to a pure research organisation, so the ARC, for example, Australian Research Council, they're not really that interested in your methodologies as long as they're adequate. Most funding bodies have some kind of applied bent to them. They want an outcome. They want to see something, rather than there are not many research funding bodies that just want research at the end of it. They want some kind of application. So it is important to align methodologies with research questions and stuff like that, but really it's all about those outcomes and deliverables. They're what's really important. Now I talked, getting back to this, knowing when to hold them and when to fold them. I knew someone who had a great idea for a project. He thought it was a great idea. He pitched it 3 or 4 times. It didn't get anywhere, but he kept hold of it, and that stopped him developing some more ideas that conceivably are more successful. I've got examples of this from my own research career. Like I mentioned, that I was very keen on doing some work with ebooks in higher education. I must have pitched that project 4 times. I set up all the social media around it to support it, and it became obvious to me that, you know what, it just is not interesting to people. People do not like this. This is not capturing anyone's imagination, and better off just to accept that and just put it to bed rather than persevering with it. So I think that's mostly what I've got to say. I'm very happy to take people's questions or comments. It is, you know, you have got to put in a lot of applications to be successful. You know, like when I won my OLT, I put 7 applications in that round, and only 1 of them was successful. So you've got to put a lot in before you are successful, and don't take it personally either. I think the best thing to do is to be really pragmatic about it. Make sure that everything you're doing, every person on that team is playing a role. Do what you have to get that funding. It might be jettisoning your best friend from the project. If you've got to do it, you've just got to do it. It might be working with a cohort you're not quite familiar with. It might be applying for funding that is not as prestigious as you'd like. We'd all like an ARC. Every one of us would like an ARC. I don't have one yet. I still want one. But I turned to another funding source. So I've turned to the Higher Education Participation and Partnerships Program, which is not traditionally research funding. But I got the money, and now I have the money, I can do research with it. So you've also got to be pretty pragmatic about thinking about where funding will come from. And you've got to accept the limitations of being at certain institutions. Being at the University of Southern Queensland, I love this place a lot, and I've had lots of great opportunities here. But the statistics show But people from universities like mine find it very hard to get ARC funding. And that's around how the ARC perceives research to be supported at regional universities. So you've just got to take all that into account and don't take any of it personally.
Okay, we have another maybe about 5 to 6 minutes. Yeah, please feel free to just drop a note on the questions that you have.
In the meantime, I will just share my photos, and that's my email address. So if you think of any questions afterwards or anything you want to ask me, you can drop me an email. I'm fine with that. No worries. And thank you everyone for coming along and giving up your lunch hour on a sunny June day. Cool.
Okay, if there are no questions, we'll probably end the session here, but we just want to thank on behalf of ASCILITE and everyone here, to thank Helen for sharing with us this afternoon during the lunchtime hour. And for the rest of us here, we hope that you have a fruitful session this afternoon, and we will keep you informed of the webinar schedule in the coming weeks. So we hope to see you at the next ASCILITE webinar, and bye for now.
Bye everyone.